Hello, I'm Michelle Davis, and welcome to Advocate with Michelle. Empower, educate, advocate. Today I'm talking about a very important topic in the field of special education and in the education process, and one that is, in my experience, misunderstood very frequently, and it's the topic of consent. So, in the special education process, if your child either is having problems in school, is suspected of having a disability, or whether the child already has a disability, the school district must get parent consent in order to conduct evaluations. Now, we all know that the school district does lots of testing and lots of assessments on children, but the type of evaluations or assessments that I'm talking about that requires parent consent are specific to the special education process and are unique to students who have learning problems, behavioral problems, and who may need or who are already receiving special education. So these are for the evaluations that the school district does not typically give to all children. So in these broadcasts, I'm going to be highlighting different topics and telling you about different case studies. So I'm going to talk about Ellie right now. And Ellie was diagnosed with autism, and her parents went through the special education process, and the very first thing the team did was consider whether she might need special education and ask permission for the parent to sign consent for the evaluations. So with our help, the parents were very comfortable in participating in this discussion in terms of what types of evaluations Ellie needed. Of course, we had sensory processing evaluations, visual motor evaluations. Those are usually in the area of occupational therapy. We had pragmatic language evaluations, receptive and expressive language evaluations, and those are usually done by a speech and language pathologist. We had asked the school team, and the parents gave consent to conduct a functional behavior assessment because some of Ellie's behaviors were interfering with her learning. And the standard assessments that the school district will propose and the parents will have to consent to are psychological and educational evaluations. I'm going to be talking all about evaluations in a different broadcast. So the very first time that a parent needs to provide consent, which is signed permission, is in the area of evaluation or reevaluation. The second time that the parent needs to provide consent is when, after the evaluations are completed, the child is determined to qualify for special education, or qualify meaning be eligible for special education, and the parents then are presented with an initial IEP. This is the very first IEP that the child has ever had. So the child, in most cases, has not had any special education or related services before under an IEP, and the parent must consent for the initial provision of special education services. This is a really important step, and so I'll tell you about Leah. Leah is a child with a specific learning disability. She has dyslexia. And the parents really wanted her to receive evidence-based and research-based reading interventions, small classroom instruction, and she had some written language difficulties and attention problems with executive functioning difficulties as well. So the parents were very concerned about her being in her neighborhood school and had in their minds that they'd like for her to have a special placement outside of the neighborhood school with the initial IEP, which of course they had to consent to in order for it to go forward. But instead of placing Leah at a different specialty learning disability or dyslexia program in the school district kept her at her neighborhood school and developed an IEP which would call for some services there. So the parents had to make a difficult decision. Would they give consent for the initial IEP remaining at her neighborhood school where she had been failing and struggling and embarrassed, and her self-esteem was starting to plummet? Or would they not sign or not give consent for that initial provision of special education services and work with the IEP team to see if the IEP team would then go ahead and place her in that smaller special education program, which was not in her neighborhood school? So the parents did decide to go ahead and sign that consent for the initial provision of special education services, but in the neighborhood school, but they negotiated back and forth with my help in terms of making sure that a appropriate reading program was going to be in place for her. And so while the initial IEP had called for just a very little bit amount of special education, we were able to say, hey, we want to give consent, the parents would like to give consent for the initial provision of special education, but would you consider adding in X, Y, and Z in terms of helping her with her reading, written language? So we added some technology, we added in research-based reading intervention to the IEP. Parents signed, and a couple of years later, Leah is still doing really well in her neighborhood school, and she's making meaningful progress. Now, this third topic for consent is a little bit tricky because, like I just said, the initial IEP needs to have the consent, but many parents do not understand that after the very first IEP, in most states, and I'm going to get into the state differences in just a minute, but in most states, after the very first IEP is developed, the next IEPs from there forward do not require parent consent. So a lot of times most of the time, parents will call me and say, well, Michelle, I'm planning on going into this IEP meeting. If I don't agree, I'm just not going to sign it. And most of the time, again, in most states, depending on where you are, that's really not the case. So after the very first IEP, generally speaking, the IEP team for the subsequent IEPs will be able to make changes. They'll be able to either increase or decrease services. They'll be able to change your child out of the diploma outcome into a certificate outcome. They'll be able to recommend that your child go to a different school. And if that's the case, parents do not have the ability to consent or not consent. Those subsequent IEPs just roll forward. This can become very tricky for parents. I'll tell you about another case study where the parent came to the IEP table and the IEP team changed the child, took the child out of the neighborhood school, placed the child in a more restrictive program that was about maybe a 30-minute, maybe 45-minute bus ride away from the child's neighborhood school. And the parent had a hard time understanding because she had contacted me after the placement change was made. She had a hard time understanding that that placement was going to roll forward unless she exercised her procedural safeguards or unless she did something in order to stop that. And I'm going to talk about that in another broadcast. That's exercising different dispute options such as a due process hearing request or mediation or some other informal ways to stop that process. Now, in some states there are differences. For example, in Virginia, the parent needs to be able to consent, like I said, for the initial provision of special education services and for evaluations. But in Virginia, the parent also has to consent for changes in the IEP, which I happen to really like and have advocated for in different states. States like Florida, states like Maryland, parents have to provide consent in order for a child to be moved from the regular curriculum or the diploma outcome to the alternate curriculum or alternate assessments. And so the IEP team can make a recommendation in terms of moving a child from diploma to certificate, but in those states and some other states, parents must consent in order for that IEP to move forward. Also in Maryland, an exciting change happened on July the 1st 2017, which was in order for the IEP team to include restraint or seclusion in the child's IEP, the parent has to consent. In Florida, there's another interesting consent regulation, which is that before the IEP team can place a child in a separate special education school, the parent must consent. And so that's a little different from other states. Now, a lot of times parents want to know, well, what if I don't provide consent, and can the school district even take me to a due process hearing as a parent? Well, it's very interesting. Let's say in the case of evaluations, the school district wants to do evaluations, the parent does not want to provide consent and will not provide consent. The school district can initiate a due process hearing request and ask a judge or a hearing officer to require the parents to have the child undergo those evaluations. But in the case of the initial IEP, the school district cannot force the parent to provide consent for initial provision of special education services. So consent, as you can tell, is somewhat complicated, and there are many situations where consent is absolutely critical for the parent to understand when going into the IEP team and the special education process. If you'd like to get in touch with me, use Facebook, use email, abc4success@gmail.com. Remember, empower, educate, advocate, and I'll be back with different topics and different case studies. This has been Advocate with Michelle.